I kept my study locked for 12 years. The combination was my late husband David's birthday, April 9th, 1961. When my son married a woman who smiled too wide and lingered too long near my filing cabinets, I had a deadbolt installed above the existing knob and changed the key entirely. 6 months ago, my son called me from his apartment downtown, his voice barely above a whisper. I listened to his trembling panic with complete tactical stillness. I had been ready for this structural breach from the very beginning, ever since the moment I first observed her transactional gaze. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't panic. I didn't question his terror. When Joshua's voice faded on the line, anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. My heartbeat didn't fluctuate by a single beat. As a structural engineer, I spent 35 years identifying hidden weaknesses before a foundation crumbled. Kayla thought she was navigating an unguarded, vulnerable terrain, but she had merely stepped onto a highly monitored grid. I tried to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a domestic breakdown. It was an exercise in accounting. I set down my coffee mug on the kitchen table. The historic brownstone around me smelled faintly of old wood and total silence. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure application linked to my security framework. Kayla believed she was being remarkably clever when she slid that brass key off the hook by the back door while I was away at my physical examination. She didn't realize that the keyring hook was a digital honeypot trap I had engineered 3 years ago. The brass key itself opened absolutely nothing. It was a decoy, a tracking mechanism wrapped in the illusion of opportunity. The moment her fingers wrapped around that metal, an automated alert had already logged her exact intrusion coordinates and transmitted a silent notification directly to my device. I didn't call her. I didn't fire off an emotional text message demanding an explanation. Premature confrontation is a structural waste of energy. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the real-time activity log. There it was, an immutable digital footprint recorded at exactly 11:14 a.m. I watched the timestamp blink on my screen, cold and undeniable. My compassion had been a luxury she had overdrafted for 22 months, but the ledger was officially closing. Love, in her mind, had been a lucrative contract with me footing the hidden bill. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, but the subscription was about to be cancelled with lethal precision. I clicked over to my secure directory and dialed my estate protection attorney. She answered on the second ring, her professional tone instantly aligning with my clinical focus. I didn't waste breath on domestic narratives or emotional grievances. I simply instructed her to initiate an immediate lockdown on every conditional asset pipeline attached to Joshua's marital framework. We froze the secondary distributions, restricted the emergency access privileges to the joint liquidity reserves, and revoked her authorization to view any underlying estate portfolios. Within 12 minutes, we had constructed an airtight legal containment field around the family estate. Kayla was still sitting in her downtown loft, likely gloating over her duplicated copy of a useless key, completely unaware that her entire financial runway had just vanished. She wasn't shocked by the ethical boundary she had crossed. She would only be shocked when she realized I had entirely stopped playing along. Inside my study, the computer screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of cold facts, absolute numbers, and quiet, systematic retribution. I closed the laptop, smoothed down my sweater, and prepared for the morning confrontation. I walked into Joshua's downtown loft at exactly 9:15 the next morning. My son stood by the kitchen counter, haggard, tightly gripping a cold coffee mug. Kayla sat at the dining table, her phone face down. When she looked up, her expression was a calculated mix of defiance and artificial poise. It was the face of a person caught red-handed who had decided an aggressive offense was her best defense. I sat down directly across from her without being invited. Joshua remained frozen at the edge of the kitchen, hovering like a ghost in his own home. I didn't open with an emotional accusation. I simply placed a heavy manila folder on the table. Inside was a physical audit of their marital banking logs spanning the last 22 months. Kayla glanced at the folder, her chin rising as she claimed she had looked into my study out of genuine concern for the family's future. I ignored her words completely. I didn't come to debate intentions. I came to read the balance sheet. I opened the folder and laid out the raw reality of their joint statements. Since their wedding day, Joshua had injected a staggering $216,000 from his logistics director salary into their shared lives. That capital funded their premium mortgage payments, hefty condo association fees, groceries, her luxury car lease, and vacations. I turned the page, looking Kayla dead in the eye. In that same 22-month window, her total deposits amounted to a hollow $1,800. She had coasted on his labor while hiding her complete professional stagnation behind a fabricated freelance marketing banner. What people misunderstand is how easily an honorable person traps themselves in the trap of cruel normalization. Kayla hadn't exploited my son overnight. She did it through a slow erosion of his boundaries in the dark. For nearly 2 years, she subtly rewrote his reality, translating her refusal to work into professional vulnerability. She told him the market was toxic, that she was building a consulting agency from scratch, and that his financial exhaustion was just standard marital support. She normalized his burden so expertly that Joshua felt guilty for even looking at his own bank statements. It was a psychological parasite dynamic, shifting the blame onto the host until the host stopped questioning the bleeding. Kayla scrambled to recalibrate, claiming her contribution wasn't monetary because she managed the household. I didn't argue. I simply slid a single receipt across the table. It was the invoice for the $180 monthly cleaning service, billed automatically to Joshua's credit card. Her domestic management argument collapsed instantly. I looked at my son, whose jaw was tightly set, and then back at the woman who had spent 2 years treating his love as an open line of credit. The accounting was complete, and her leverage was officially zero. Kayla didn't fold. When the evidence exposed the absolute void of her freelance performance, her posture hardened, shifting instantly from unmasked fraud to volatile indignation. She stood up, her eyes flashing with a calculated, desperate rage. She looked past me, aiming her psychological artillery directly at my son. She told Joshua I was destroying their marriage, that my structural protections were nothing more than pathological control and an invasive, malicious assault on their private life cycle. She slammed her hand on the dining table, declaring that my cold analysis was an insult to family unity. She brazenly asserted that as his spouse, she had a legal right to access the underlying estate wealth under the guise of sensible family planning. She even vowed to unleash her own counsel to challenge the prenuptial agreement she had signed 4 days before the wedding, calling it a toxic trap. I watched my son stand entirely frozen near the kitchen doorway, his head down, tightly gripping the counter, as if the room were tilting. He was caught in the invisible chain of a survivor. When a person exists in an emotionally abusive environment for long enough, their silence isn't weakness. It is a learned survival mechanism. For 22 months, Joshua had been living in a structural prison without iron bars, a psychological condition where every attempt to voice his financial anxiety had been twisted by Kayla into an act of selfishness or betrayal. He had been systematically trained to absorb her emotional noise, to smooth over her hostility, and to finance her stagnation just to keep the peace. The heavy atmosphere in the loft felt thick, smelling of old gaslighting tactics and his quiet, paralyzing exhaustion. Kayla weaponized his paralysis, turning back to me with a sharp, icy smirk. She told me I had never given her a fair shot, that I was a bitter, overprotective widow who couldn't handle her only child, building a life outside her thumb. She claimed her lack of employment was a mere market variable, a temporary setback that didn't diminish her right to be included in our estate planning. Her voice carried a practiced, venomous confidence, completely void of a single drop of remorse or accountability. She truly believed she could bully my framework and manipulate her way into the assets. But she had badly miscalculated. She didn't realize that every desperate attack and public lie only provided the absolute confirmation I required. Her total lack of regret eliminated any remaining path to redemption, giving me the clear green light for systematic legal warfare. I didn't get angry. My focus remained clinical. I looked at the manila folder sitting between us, representing the absolute ceiling of her deception. The domestic performance was officially over. I turned to my son, ready to pull him out of the ruins and activate a professional lockdown she couldn't possibly survive. I didn't answer a single one of Kayla's desperate threats. I simply looked at my son, saw the suffocating weight dragging him down, and told him we were leaving. He didn't object. He followed me out of the loft like a man stepping out of a collapsed tunnel. The drive back to my historic brownstone in Beacon Hill was entirely silent, but the quiet wasn't empty. It was the heavy stillness of an impending structural alignment. I watched him in my rearview mirror, recognizing the exact moment his emotional paralysis began to crack under the cold light of reality. We entered my study, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind us. The room smelled of old paper, leather books, and absolute security. Sitting at my mahogany desk was my asset protection attorney, a woman who had spent the last 8 months quietly reinforcing our borders under my strict directives. Joshua sat in the leather chair across from us, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the empty floor. I stood by the window, looking out at the grey Boston skyline. This wasn't a family drama anymore, it was a corporate restructuring. I unlocked the fireproof cabinet and pulled out the legal framework. For 15 years, this asset map had remained completely hidden from him. Not because I didn't trust him, but because my late husband David and I had designed it to ensure he would build his own career and confidence without the soft illusion of an unguarded safety net. I slid the trust deed across the desk. I told him plainly that our family estate was completely encapsulated. The architecture was final, ironclad, and entirely beyond the jurisdiction of a predatory marriage. I had the attorney map out the line items with clinical precision. The trust held full legal ownership of the brownstone, valued at $1,400,000 in the current market. It securely contained our active investment portfolio, a sum totaling a little over $1,800,000. And upon my death, the $800,000 total from the active life insurance policies would flow directly back into the trust structure, not to him personally. In total, a $4 million estate was completely insulated behind an impenetrable legal barrier. Joshua stared at the numbers, watching the legal walls rise around his life like a protective armor. For 22 months, he had been made to feel like he was failing as a provider, but now he was looking at an economic reality that Kayla could never touch. He looked up at me, his eyes clearing as the weight of his false guilt dissolved. He was finally realizing the calculated precision that his parents had engineered to keep our generational legacy safe from outside predation. The structural armor was active, and Kayla was completely locked out. I reached back into the top drawer of the fireproof cabinet and pulled out a separate envelope. It was a piece of paper I'd been carrying for 11 years, waiting for the exact structural moment to hand it over. On the front, my late husband David's neat, fading ink spelled out Joshua's name with that familiar, deliberate slant. I stood near the window, watching the historic streets of Beacon Hill while my son broke the seal. David had written that letter 2 weeks before his passing. When Joshua was 21 and finishing his junior year of college, he had understood the exact contours of human manipulation long before Kayla ever stepped through our door. As Joshua read his father's words, the room filled with a sudden, heavy clarity. David's voice echoed off the pages, delivering an analytical truth that broke right through my son's defense of his wife. He wrote about why we built the trust, recalling how his own grandmother had lost her paid-off home and entire pension to an opportunistic predator. And then he left Joshua with a metric that cut straight to the core of this entire nightmare. Generosity under observation is performance. Generosity in private is character. Find someone who has the second kind. That is the person worth trusting with everything. Joshua folded the letter with trembling fingers, his breathing uneven against the heavy silence. Looking at his pale face, my own silent regret as a guardian finally surfaced. I told him the truth. I had hidden behind my clinical boundaries for nearly 2 years. I had clocked Kayla's calculating nature during our very first dinner together, watching her mentally convert every piece of antique furniture and estate asset into a baseline dollar value. But I had chosen to watch from the shadows, enduring the agonizing discomfort of her slow extraction of his life cycle income because I was completely terrified of a different kind of structural collapse. I was terrified that if I pushed too hard or spoke too directly, Joshua would choose her, and I would lose my only child forever. It was a selfish silence wrapped in the costume of protection, and I owned that structural failure entirely. But the emotional landscape of the room shifted into something lethal when my attorney stepped forward. She didn't offer generic comfort. She dropped the definitive kill shot. A forensic digital sweep of our system had flagged an anomaly. 6 months ago, while I was undergoing my medical appointment, Kayla had compromised my digital patient portal to illegally access my private medical files. Her team was attempting to weaponize minor health data, preparing a fraudulent court petition to forge physician signatures and declare me mentally incompetent due to diminished capacity. They wanted to strip away my legal execution rights and forcibly override the parameters of the family trust. The conflict instantly expanded past a messy domestic dispute and escalated into a criminal felony. Kayla wasn't just a parasite coasting on my son's salary. She was a criminal actor caught in an explicit conspiracy to commit identity fraud and asset theft. The discovery completely removed any remaining path to marital redemption. I looked at Joshua. The exhaustion in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, unyielding iron that he had inherited directly from his parents. We had the digital evidence, the timeline, and an absolute legal mandate for her total extraction from the system. We went back to the downtown apartment together. That hadn't been my initial plan, but Joshua asked me to come, and I understood why. There are conversations a person needs a witness for, not for emotional support, but for the grounding quality of an objective presence in the room. Kayla was on the couch when we came in. She'd changed clothes and done her makeup while we were gone, which told me something about how she'd spent the intervening hours. She looked composed, weaponized, and prepared for a standard domestic negotiation. Joshua stood squarely in the center of the living room. He had his father, David's, precise way of gathering his posture before delivering a difficult truth, a heavy stillness that predators often mistake for hesitation, but is actually the opposite. Kayla leaned forward, her voice dropping into a soft, private tone as she asked to speak with him alone. Joshua didn't budge. He looked at her with an analytical detachment that proved her psychological control over him had completely dissolved. He told her flatly that he had spent the last 2 hours reviewing their financial data. He laid out the raw numbers without a hint of anger. $216,000 contributed by his own labor toward their lifestyle, balanced against her hollow total of $1,800. Kayla opened her mouth to deploy another excuse about her competitive market, but Joshua cut through the noise. He informed her that he had personally run a corporate background check on the freelance consulting firm she claimed to operate. There was no record of it with the state business registry. Her entire career was an absolute fabrication. Her face went carefully neutral as her leverage evaporated. Realizing her professional cover was blown, she intensely shifted to her final asset card, her marital residency rights. She coldly reminded him that she had occupied the apartment as his spouse for nearly 2 years, asserting that legal protections would block any removal. I stepped forward, delivering the clinical framework my attorney had verified. The apartment was separate property, purchased entirely with Joshua's independent funds before the marriage, and titled solely in his name. Her spousal argument was legally bankrupt. That was the exact moment the performance ended. The mask dissolved as she realized that maintaining the illusion was a structural waste of energy. She looked at him with an expression that had stopped pretending. "I thought you had more than you do," she said finally. "I thought the house was yours, or at least partially yours. I thought by now we'd be living there, that the equity would be part of our future. I thought the accounts your father talks around were going to be accessible within a reasonable amount of time. I thought a lot of things that turned out to not be true." "So you stayed," Joshua said slowly, "because you were waiting for access to money." "I stayed because I cared about you," she said, and the defensive note was back in her voice. "I stayed because we have a life together. But yes, I also thought that life included financial security. That's not a crime. Everyone considers finances when they get married. You just don't admit it." "I considered your finances," Joshua said. "I thought about whether I could support us on my salary while you built your business. I factored in your timeline. I adjusted my own savings goals to accommodate your stated plan. I did all of that in good faith. What you're describing is different." She said nothing. "You didn't consider our finances," he continued. "You considered my family's legacy, my family's finances. That's what you were actually calculating. And when you found out they weren't going to be available to you the way you thought, you started pushing. The house, moving in, the renovations, the estate planning questions. That wasn't being practical. That was looking for a way in." He ran his hand along the back of the couch. His voice was very even. My father set up a trust when I was 21 because he grew up watching what happened when a family's security was left unguarded, he said. He spent the last months of his life making sure I'd be protected, and I almost handed that protection to someone who was sitting across the table from my mother, asking her about her retirement plans on your very first visit to her house. Kayla's expression shifted. There was real anger in it now, unfiltered. You want to talk about your father? Fine. Let's talk about the fact that your mother has kept you in the dark for your entire adult life, pulling strings behind the scenes, arranging things without your knowledge or consent. That's not protection. That's control. She never trusted you to make your own decisions. She made them for you and let you believe you were choosing freely. My mother told me the truth this morning, Joshua said. She told me she should have been more direct sooner and that she was wrong not to be. She said it plainly and without making excuses. She sat in a room with me for 2 hours and answered every question I had. He paused. I've been asking you questions about your work situation for 22 months, and I've gotten a different excuse every time. There's a difference between someone who made a mistake in how they protected you and someone who made a plan to take advantage of you. I know which one I'm looking at. The silence stretched. Kayla picked up her phone from the coffee table. She turned it over once in her hand, then set it back down. Her jaw was tight. If you're asking me to leave, she said, you should know that I have rights here. This apartment may be in your name, but I've been living here as your spouse for nearly 2 years. There are legal protections. I've already spoken with an attorney, I said. She said the same thing. Joshua's apartment, purchased before the marriage and titled in his name alone, is separate property in this state. Your protections are to your personal belongings, the contents of the joint account, and anything that can be demonstrated as a direct marital contribution. Given the financial picture we've just reviewed, that's going to be a limited argument. She looked at me with an expression that had stopped pretending. You had this whole thing prepared, she said. The attorney, the trust, the prenuptial agreement, all of it. Before I'd done anything, I had it prepared because people like you exist, I said. Not because I knew it would be you specifically, because David knew it might be someone, and he made sure I knew what to do. Kayla looked at Joshua one last time. Her expression had shifted into something that was almost sad, but not the kind of sadness that comes from remorse, the kind that comes from losing. You have 2 days, Joshua said. The joint account has what it has. You're welcome to your half of it. He walked to the door and opened it, not as a gesture of aggression, just as a statement of fact. She left without saying anything else. The legal machinery moved swiftly over the next 4 months. Kayla's strategic attempts to spin a narrative of marital abandonment withered completely under judicial scrutiny. The prenuptial agreement held seamlessly an airtight structural shield that protected every single asset David and I had spent 35 years engineering. She exited our lives entirely, isolated by the exposure of her own failed calculations. Joshua handled the legal proceedings with a quiet, unyielding finality. He didn't carry a single drop of bitter anger. He carried the sharp, cleansing clarity of a man who had finally looked at a toxic threat and removed it permanently from his foundation. Winter slowly dissolved, giving way to a warm, vibrant late spring that flooded the historic rooms of my Beacon Hill brownstone with a beautiful, unhurried light. The house felt entirely different now, cleansed of hidden inventories, parasitic calculations, and suffocating silence. Joshua began deeply reclaiming his space, his career, and his ancestral legacy. He spent his weekends opening the old boxes in my study, tracing his father's neat blue ink, and breathing in the memory of a family that had loved him unconditionally. A few weeks ago, he invited me out to join him and Jasmine for Sunday dinner at a quiet restaurant near the waterfront. She is a fully autonomous landscape architect, a structural equal who carries herself with an innate, effortless confidence. She looked at the old photographs of David in the living room and asked deep, genuine questions about who he was, not what he had owned. When the dinner check arrived, she took the folder before Joshua could move, looking at him with a brilliant, spontaneous smile. She stated plainly that she had an unshakable rule about paying her own way during the early stages of dating, proudly honoring a financial boundary that required no observation to prove its character. I felt an immense weight finally lift and dissolve in my chest. Sitting on the back porch as the evening slowly darkens over the yard, I look at my son and realize he has turned out extraordinary. I've come to realize that we frequently mistake compliance for family peace, and we excuse our own paralyzing silence as a noble way to protect a loved one's immediate happiness. But the unpopular, hard-earned truth is that kindness without protection is just vulnerability with a prettier name. If you find yourself in a similar situation, carrying the crushing anxiety of a relationship where your boundaries are treated as a personal insult, remember that walking away isn't an act of betrayal. It is an act of absolute self-preservation. Forgiveness isn't always about repairing a bridge with someone who sought to systematically exploit your trust. Sometimes it is the quiet, unyielding decision to drop the mask of their expectations and set your own life entirely free. You do not owe your loyalty to anyone who demands that you make yourself smaller so they can remain comfortable. True peace belongs to those who have the immense courage to keep the lock on, guarding your sanctuary against those who only know how to treat love as an open line of credit. Look at the hard things directly, protect your foundation, and value the quiet life you build from the truth. If this story reminded you of your own worth and the power of setting unshakable boundaries, hit that share button right now. Don't let someone you love face a predator unprotected. Send this to them today and drop a comment below with your thoughts.